So we've talked about the parts of a cell, plant and animal cells, prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. And now we're talking about what's happening within those cells. So in this unit, we're discussing how cells are making and using energy. So first of all, let's define energy. Energy in its simplest definition is the ability to do work. So this can be a term that we use in physics when we're talking about pushing objects or pulling objects. But here we're specifically talking about cellular biological work. So for example, the ability to move your muscles and move your body requires biological energy. Other examples of ways that your cells use energy is the generation of nerve signals, pumping of your blood, and actively transporting wastes from the cell. We talked about active transport previous to this, and that is because it's an active transport, it requires energy. Energy comes in various types, such as light energy, mechanical energy, and chemical energy. There are other forms of energy, but we're not going to work on those in this unit. Ultimately, all energy on Earth originally comes from the sun, and it can then be, or I should say, all chemical and biological energy on Earth originally comes from the sun. Obviously, you can have potential energy or kinetic energy when we're talking about physical objects, but here we're talking about living organisms. And that energy from the sun can be converted by plants into chemical energy. And chemical energy is stored in the bonds of chemical compounds or molecules. So when atoms are bonded together, the atoms form bonds that store chemical energy or store energy, and that allows it to be transported around the cell, around the organism, the plant, animal, human, whatever we're talking about. So that chemical energy is a transportable, a portable form of energy. ATP is the specific molecule that we are going to discuss this unit that your cells use for energy. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. It is like the energy currency for cells because it can store and transport energy from one location to another. So energy can be stored in all kinds of different compounds in an organism, but ATP is the molecule that your body and organisms specifically use and create in order to transport energy around the cell. And so it is like the energy currency. So for example, carrier proteins, which we discussed previously, require energy to move substances across the membrane. Mitochondria break down large molecules to make ATP. And this ATP then travels to the membrane to be used in small amounts by the carrier proteins. So ATP is the small energy molecule that allows energy to be used in different parts of the cell, in different parts of the organism. For example, in the carrier proteins. So here's just an analogy for you. Imagine you go to a vending machine, but you only have a $100 bill. The money has a lot of value, but you can't use it to get a snack from the vending machine because it has to be broken down into $1 usable pieces. So just like the chemical energy formed by plants is a very large, high value piece of energy, the ATP molecules are the change. These are the smaller bits of energy that can be transported and used in for different functions around the organism. And these ATP molecules are made from glucose, and we'll discuss more about how that happens in just a second. But for now, all you need to know about ATP besides what it stands for, is that it is the usable energy currency in the small bits of energy that are going to be transported around your cells. So here's its structure. It's made of adenine, which is this molecule here. These are carbons. When we draw carbons, we commonly draw them as a ring structure like this. Ribose, so it has adenine, ribose, and 3 phosphate groups. So 1, 2, 3 phosphate groups, which is how it's known as triphosphate. And this adenine and ribose together is the adenosine portion of that. So how does the structure of ATP, which we just looked at, store and release energy? So if this is the molecule that is storing energy and releasing it for the cells to use, how does this molecular structure make that happen? So we talked about energy being stored in bonds. And when the bond between the second and third phosphate groups is broken, that is when energy is released and can be used by the cell. So bonds right here in between the second and third phosphate groups here, the third one being on the end, these bonds are what are going to store and release energy for the cell. So when that bond is broken, energy is released. When the bond is formed, energy is stored. So the resulting molecules that are left after that last phosphate breaks off and the bond is broken are called adenosine diphosphate, which makes sense because di means 2, so there'd be 2 phosphates left, and an independent phosphate. So we say that in order to release energy from the ATP molecule, you have to break off that last phosphate, and then when that bond is broken, energy is released, and then you're left with ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and 1 independent phosphate, which we write like this. When the second and third phosphate groups bond together again, which is the reverse reaction, when they form a bond, energy is then stored in that bond, and then we call that molecule ATP. So this functions like a cycle. ATP is constantly being broken down in an organism to use energy, and then when energy is formed or ingested, it is stored then again as ATP. So how might cells use ATP? What do they need it for? One example is responding to signals on the cell surface. We discussed that cells have a membrane that has proteins and carbohydrates and cholesterol embedded in it, and there are compounds on the cell's surface, on that cell membrane, that help the cell to recognize other cells and its environment. And so one of those signals require ATP, require energy in order to process the environment. Creating proteins is another way that cells use ATP. We'll get into more on the details of that as we get through the course. And of course, we discussed how active transport of substances across the cell membrane requires ATP, because often the substances are moving from an area of low concentration to high concentration, which is opposite its natural gradient. So that would require energy as well. Another example here is sperm cells that use ATP for movement. So all of these purple cells are sperm cells, and they use the ATP not only to move towards the egg cell, but also to perforate through the egg membrane and fertilize the egg. So in summary, ATP stores chemical energy in the bonds between its 3 phosphate groups. When the last phosphate group is removed, energy is released from the bond to be used by the cell. So what organisms use these processes of making and storing energy and using energy? We divide organisms into two different major sections. First of all organisms require energy, and this energy comes from food. But autotrophs can make their own food from sunlight. So auto meaning self, they can make their own food, troph, food. And that process of making their own food is called photosynthesis. While heterotrophs, hetero different, trophs to eat, so they need to consume other organisms for food. They need to get their food from a different source. They can't make their own. So in autotrophs, where is this photosynthetic process happening? Where are they making their own food for energy? Chlorophyll is a pigment that's found in chloroplasts. So we talked about chloroplasts as one of the organelles, and that is where photosynthesis occurs. So that's where that process occurs, and we'll go through the full process of photosynthesis in a little bit here. Chloroplasts are organelles that have two membranes. Inside are stacks of sac-like thylakoids. So here are the two membranes of the chloroplast, an outer membrane and an inner membrane, and then inside that are these sac-like thylakoids, these stacks. And a stack of thylakoids is called a granum, so this whole section here. The space surrounding the stacks is called the stroma, so that's this blank space here. And that's where some of the reactions occur. So how does a chloroplast use light energy to make food? Because the goal here is to convert light energy into chemical energy, and the chemical energy is in the food made by the plants. So how is it using that light energy? Well, you might already know that white light, which is what sunlight is made of, is actually made of many colors. And we call those colors Roy G. Biv: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. And each of those colors is caused by a different wavelength of light. So white light here it's comprised of all of these different colors. And that's what makes a rainbow when it's refracted through raindrops. You can see all the different colors, the Roy G. Biv colors. And pigments in the plant leaves absorb some of the colors of this white light within the white light and to reflect others. So a white surface here is actually going to reflect all the colors of the white light, and so it's going to appear white to your eye because it's not absorbing any of those colors. A black surface actually absorbs all of the colors within white light, so it's not going to reflect any light to your eye, and that's why it appears black. But if you see something that looks like it's a color, that color is actually being reflected to your eye, where all the other colors are being absorbed into that surface. So when you're looking at a green plant, that green light is being reflected to your eye, and these flowers, the red light's being reflected to your eye, and all the other colors are being absorbed by those leaves. So the chlorophyll in the leaves of the plants absorbs blue and violet and red light, but it reflects green and yellow, which is why that plant looks green or light green, yellowish green to your eye. So what is happening with that light that's actually being absorbed into the chlorophyll in the plant? That's what the chlorophyll is there for. It's a pigment that's absorbing the light energy. What's it doing with that? Well, this process of photosynthesis that's happening in the chloroplast, and the chlorophyll is being stored here, remember, in the thylakoids. This process is divided into two major sections. The first one is called the light-dependent reactions because they require light. They're dependent on light. And then the second major section is called light-independent reactions because they are independent of light. They do not require light energy. So as you can see here, I have this drawing divided in half. Light energy is entering the thylakoids. These are the light-dependent reactions. What's happening here is light-dependent because it's using that sunlight. And then the other half of those reactions is light-independent. It's not, there's no sunlight coming into this part of the process. So as an overview here, when light energy is absorbed by chlorophyll, which is what's happening here, it adds energy to electrons within that chlorophyll. And those high energy electrons are transported between the light dependent reactions here and the light independent reactions on a transport molecule, which is known as NADP+. And when those electrons are transported on NADP+, it is known as NADPH. And so this molecule has those high energy electrons being transported on it, and then this NADP you can see coming back, that is after it has released some of that those high energy electrons over on the light independent reactions. So this is a little bit complicated, but we're going to break it down into what's really coming into the process of photosynthesis and what's going out. But just generally know that the light-dependent reactions require light and the light-independent reactions do not. And there are molecules being transported back and forth here in order to connect those two processes together. So the overall equation for photosynthesis involves 4 inputs, 4 resources that autotrophs need to make this process occur. Sunlight, carbon dioxide, which we haven't talked about yet, but you might know that plants require carbon dioxide, water, of course you know that plants require water, and chlorophyll, which we have talked about so far. So here are 4 different inputs here. We've got light energy coming in, and we've got carbon dioxide coming in from the air, water coming in from the roots of and also from the leaves of the plant, and then chlorophyll, which is being found in the leaves, and then oxygen is leaving, which we'll talk about in a second. So the full equation is 6 molecules of carbon dioxide plus 6 molecules of water plus light energy in the presence of chlorophyll will yield 1 molecule of glucose. This is C6H12O6 is glucose, which is the simplest sugar. That's how that chemical energy is being stored. This is the food molecule that's storing the light energy, basically, is chemical energy. So this is the energy storage food molecule for the plant cells. And then oxygen, 6 molecules of oxygen are being given off. So carbon dioxide plus water plus light in the presence of chlorophyll gives you sugar and oxygen. And that is the overall equation. So generally, this is what's happening as an overview of photosynthesis. This is how light energy is being turned into chemical energy in the form of sugars. So in summary, autotrophs use light energy to create sugars for food. The light energy is absorbed by pigments like chlorophyll found within chloroplasts to energize electrons for use in chemical reactions. So let's talk about what's really happening here in photosynthesis in our 2 different portions. So for simplicity, we're going to break down the word photosynthesis into 2 different stages. The photo part, which means light, and the synthesis part, which means making a product. In this process, where our product is going to be sugar. So this is essentially what happens in the light dependent and light independent reactions. The light dependent reactions take in light. That's the photo part. And then the synthesis part is the light independent reactions, and those produce the sugars. So this is an easy way for you to think about how these two processes work together. The photo portion is the light dependent, and the synthesis portion is the light independent. So what specifically happens to sunlight in the light dependent reactions? So the light-dependent reactions occur in the thylakoids of the chloroplasts. We've talked about this so far. The thylakoids are here, and this is where the light-dependent reactions are occurring. In those chloroplasts, light is collected by two photosystems, which are a combination of chlorophyll, pigments, and specialized proteins. So we could get into some real nitty-gritty here about what's happening in these photosystems, but for what you need to know is just that there's a collection of chlorophyll, pigments, and specialized proteins, and those are all different types of compounds and molecules that are working together in that in those thylakoids. So the photosystems collect sunlight and use it to energize electrons, which move through various molecules, releasing energy as they go. And we call that the electron transport chain. As energy is given off by the electrons, it's being stored as ATP. And remember, we're storing energy in ATP in the bonds between the second and third phosphate. So the photosystems are really just a collection of molecules that are energizing electrons and releasing it slowly, releasing energy slowly and storing it as ATP. In the light-dependent reactions, there's also water that's being brought in. So we talked about water being an input, but what exactly is happening to that water? So water, of course, its molecular formula is H2O. So water molecules are being broken apart in this light-dependent reaction in a process called photolysis. This is where your prefixes and suffixes really come in handy. Photo, again, means light. Lysis means to break apart. So we are breaking apart these water molecules using light. When those molecules of H2O are broken apart, the electrons from the water molecules are replacing the electrons in the electron transport chain. Remember, the electron transport chain is producing high energy electrons that are being stored as ATP. Those high energy electrons have to be replaced somehow. So it's the electrons in the H2O molecules that are going to replace those high energy electrons and keep the process moving. So the photolysis process here is that two water molecules are entering the reaction and they are giving off 4 hydrogen protons, 4 electrons, which are going to go to the electron transport chain, and the remainder is going to be oxygen. So that's how the oxygen gas is being released from this process. The protons from the H2O hitch a ride on NADP+, and that helps them to become the NADPH molecules. And oxygen is being released from the plant. So your overall process of photolysis here, again, water, the hydrogen protons, which are going into the light independent reactions, and then oxygen that's being released. So that's your overall process for the light dependent reactions. And here's what it looks like if we are taking a really close look at these photosystems. So this is the very complicated version of this process. Notice that water is taken in on the left. So water's coming in here, light's coming in as well. And the electrons, which are your E's along here, are gaining energy from the sunlight. This is actually photosystem 2, photosystem 1. And the electrons are passing along these photosystems, along many different molecules here as they gain and lose energy until they finally pass it to be stored in NADPH and ATP. And those are going to be passed then to the light-independent reactions. So again, this is why we're not getting into all of the different molecules involved in these photosystems, because it is quite complex. So if you know that light and water is coming in here and that oxygen is being released from photolysis and these electrons are being energized by light and passed along molecules to give off these two products, that's pretty much what you need to know from this image. So what happens in the light-independent reactions again? So we just did the first part here, light-dependent reactions. We made our ATP, as you just saw, and we made NADPH. And now what's happening in the light-independent reactions in the second portion here? The light-independent reactions occur in the stroma of the chloroplast. So this is outside of the thylakoids in that space. They do not require sunlight. That's why they're called light independent. And we also call this process the Calvin cycle. So that's just a common name for light independent reactions. Because this isn't complicated enough, we need to have multiple names for things. So in the light independent reactions, this is where we're bringing in the carbon dioxide. And then ATP and NADPH from the light dependent reactions are also coming into this second portion, and they enter into the Calvin cycle. Through a series of reactions, the carbon dioxide is transformed into a 6-carbon compound known as glucose, which is simple sugar. So here's what this looks like. And again, we are not getting into the nitty-gritty details here, but carbon dioxide is being brought in and it is going through the Calvin cycle here, and it is eventually going to leave as a 6-carbon sugar. And then part of this cycle, some of these molecules are being recycled. So that's how the process continues. That's why we call it a Calvin cycle. And your ATP and NADPH is coming in to be used and stored here as well. So in summary, the light-dependent reactions are bringing in water and light energy and using chlorophyll to produce oxygen, ATP, and NADPH. And then the light-independent reactions are bringing in carbon dioxide with these two inputs to produce glucose. So light-dependent reactions take in light energy and water, give off oxygen, and send ATP and NADPH to the light-independent reactions, which are going to convert carbon dioxide into glucose in the Calvin cycle. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an overview about what's happening in this photosynthesis process. Again, our goal is to convert light energy into chemical energy, which is in the form of bonds in the molecule of glucose. So in photosynthesis, light energy is turned into chemical energy, but that chemical energy is not yet in the ATP form that is required for cells to use it. So right now it's being stored as glucose, and that's fine for the plants to use and autotrophs when they need to store that chemical energy. But in order to use it, we need to go through another process. So photosynthesis is a great way to store energy, but for usable energy, the food molecules must be broken down. And the process to do that is called cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is the process by which all organisms break down glucose to gradually produce energy in the form of ATP. Because remember, ATP is the goal here because that is the energy currency for the cell. So that is the format that we need the energy in. but we need to get it from the stored energy in glucose into that ATP. So cellular respiration is how that occurs. And it's used by all organisms, not just autotrophs. So the process begins with glucose, and that's our stored chemical energy. We're going to add oxygen to that process. And in the process of breaking down that sugar, we are going to release carbon dioxide, water, and what we would ultimately want there, which is energy in the form of ATP. So as you can see in this equation, the inputs of photosynthesis are the outputs of respiration and vice versa. So in photosynthesis, carbon dioxide and water and light energy went in, and now in cellular respiration, those are our outputs. That's what's coming out. So in a lot of ways, this is an opposite process. But the energy that we end up with at the end of cellular respiration is ATP, not light energy. So this actually becomes usable energy, whereas light energy, which goes into the process, is not usable. So scientists say that the process of photosynthesis is the opposite of cellular respiration. So there are three major steps in this process of cellular respiration: glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. Glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm, which is that jelly-like substance in the cell, all over the cell. And the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain occur in the mitochondria. Remember, we discussed organelles and talked about how mitochondria is where food energy is broken down and energy is produced. This is the process of what's happening there in that mitochondria. Now, this process can look a little bit different depending on whether oxygen is available to start that reaction, or if it's not available, then the process looks different. So if oxygen is available, all three steps of cellular respiration will occur. So if we have oxygen here available, all three of these steps are going to occur. And the ultimate yield of those three steps is going to be 36 ATP. So 36 of those physical ATP molecules for every one glucose molecule that goes in. So one glucose, one C6H12O6 molecule goes in and can form 36 ATP from it. The process of doing that is called aerobic respiration. So aerobic respiration being one type of cellular respiration. And this is the one that involves oxygen. If oxygen is available, aerobic respiration is going to occur. If oxygen is not available, then glycolysis will be followed by a fermentation process, and only 2 ATP are going to be used. This process is known as anaerobic respiration. So in this entire process here of cellular respiration, the making of energy or ATP from glucose, both of the processes, the aerobic and anaerobic respiration, both start with glycolysis. But if oxygen is available, then the process of aerobic respiration will occur and 36 ATP will be made. If oxygen is not available, glycolysis is going to be followed by fermentation in an anaerobic respiration process. And then only 2 ATP are made, which is obviously not ideal, hence the frowny face here. So the ideal process here is that glycolysis is occurring in the presence of oxygen, and therefore a full 36 ATP can be formed from that process. That's the ideal process for the cell because it makes the most energy from one glucose molecule. Fermentation and anaerobic respiration occur when There's not enough oxygen, and this is the alternate process. It makes a little bit of ATP, but not nearly as useful to the cell as the aerobic respiration process. So in summary, cellular respiration occurs in all organisms to produce energy from glucose. If oxygen is present, ATP can be efficiently produced through aerobic respiration. If oxygen is not present, cells produce less ATP through anaerobic respiration. And we'll talk about each of those different processes as we continue here. So now we're going to go through the 3 steps of aerobic respiration, specifically what is happening in each of those steps: glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and electron transport chain. So starting with glycolysis, a glucose molecule is broken into 2 pyruvic acid molecules. And this should be fairly easy to figure out here what's happening, because glyco means glucose and lysis means to break apart, just like we talked about photolysis. This is glycolysis. So 2 pyruvic acid molecules are the product of this reaction. And there's also 2 ATP being produced from glycolysis, which is in the anaerobic process where fermentation follows. This 2 ATP, that's where they're coming from. Finally, electrons are being passed on a molecule known as NAD+, which creates NADH when it has electrons added to it. And that NADH is going to be passing those high energy electrons onto the electron transport chain. So similar process here to photosynthesis, but we're working in reverse here. We're starting with glucose, breaking it down into pyruvic acid, and this is the process of glycolysis. And then we are forming that NADH, which is actually going to go on to the electron transport chain. And remember, 2 ATP are being formed here. So far we've accomplished the first of the 3 steps in aerobic respiration. And remember, this is occurring in the mitochondria. Most of this is occurring in the mitochondria, but the glycolysis is occurring in the cytoplasm, which is sometimes also called cytosol. In the mitochondria, the Krebs cycle is next. And in the Krebs cycle, the pyruvic acid is breaking down, releasing carbon dioxide, ATP, and high energy electrons. And those electrons, again, are traveling to the electron transport chain on molecules known as FAD and NAD+. So we are churning through this Krebs cycle, bringing in pyruvic acid, releasing carbon dioxide and ATP, and then taking those high energy electrons from these transporter molecules over to the electron transport chain. So I like to think of NADH and FADH2. These are just like buses. They're just carrying these electrons over to the electron transport chain. And then they're going to drop them off and be recycled back to where they came from. So this is step 2, which we're going to collectively call the Krebs cycle. And moving on to our 3rd step of aerobic respiration, the electron transport chain. In the electron transport chain, high energy electrons are getting dropped off from those bus molecules, and they're being passed along a series of molecules. Some of those electrons are going to join with hydrogen and oxygen to become water, and that's going to be released from the cell. The rest of them that aren't being released as water are going to be used to transport protons across the mitochondrial membrane. So here's what it looks like. As the H+ ions, which we can also call protons, move back across the membrane, they turn a molecule called ATP synthase, which generates large amounts of ATP. So here we've got protons, which are those H plus molecules that are being pumped across from the high energy electrons. And then as they move back through this ATP synthase channel, it turns and it produces ATP by combining ADP and the independent phosphate. It's the job of this molecule is to join those two molecules together and produce ATP. So this is like the ATP creator right here, molecule. And that happens because these electrons are pushing those protons across the membrane and then they are naturally flowing back. Again, this is much more detailed than you really need to understand for this process, but generally what you need to know here is that we're creating a large amount of ATP through this electron transport chain process, and that the electrons are moving from molecule to molecule, releasing energy. And that's our full process of aerobic respiration. So now we've done glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and then finished off with the electron transport chain. And as you can see, oxygen's coming in here and water's being removed as we are picking up a couple of high energy electrons and dropping them off, and the rest of them are being used to create this large amount of ATP. So in summary, glycolysis breaks down glucose and passes pyruvic acid to the Krebs cycle, which releases carbon dioxide. ATP is made at each step, but primarily in the electron transport chain, along with H2O, water. Okay, let's finish this unit off by going through the process of anaerobic respiration. So we just talked about what happens in the 3 steps of aerobic respiration: glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and electron transport chain. But as you just learned, oxygen is essential for the electron transport chain to function. So when oxygen is not available to pick up those extra electrons, the entire process fails. So glycolysis can still produce a little bit of energy without oxygen. It can produce 2 ATP, as we mentioned, but this process also converts NAD plus into NADH. And so to prevent the NAD plus from running out, it is recycled in a process called fermentation. So here we're starting with glucose and turning it into pyruvic acid in the process of glycolysis. We're creating 2 ATP here, but we are also using up that NAD plus. And so in order to prevent this from completely stopping, there's a process known as fermentation, which produces NAD plus, again, to keep this cycle moving. Even though we're creating very little ATP from this process, we can keep it going. And fermentation can produce some interesting products. There are 2 different types of fermentation, depending on which organism is going through the process. Yeast uses alcoholic fermentation, while other organisms use lactic acid fermentation. And alcoholic fermentation is something you are probably familiar with because it produces ethyl alcohol and carbon dioxide, which is why it's used in baking of bread, production of beer, wine, and other alcoholic beverages. And lactic acid fermentation, which occurs in other organisms, is used to produce kimchi, pickles, sauerkraut, yogurt, and sour cream, all of which have bacteria in them, and this process helps to give them that sour flavor. Both of those fermentation processes produce NAD+, which is recycled and allows the process of glycolysis to continue. So when is fermentation used? When does this occur as opposed to aerobic respiration? In humans, lactic acid fermentation is used for quick energy, like sprinting and lifting weights. For longer energy requirements like marathons and endurance events, fermentation doesn't provide enough energy, so aerobic respiration is required. So we're talking about a very quick burst of energy that allows fermentation. It can use fermentation, but if you are requiring long energy bursts, then aerobic respiration is going to be required. And that means that you need a constant supply of oxygen for that aerobic respiration process to occur. So the more in shape an athlete is, the better equipped their bodies are at maintaining aerobic respiration and not running out of oxygen. So that means that their lungs are better equipped for bringing in more oxygen. Their hearts are better equipped for long periods of oxygen use to pump that oxygen around, and therefore they can have a longer amount of energy because they are using aerobic respiration, which produces more ATP, and they don't have to go through the fermentation process because they don't run out of oxygen because they are in shape. In summary, fermentation occurs after glycolysis and only when oxygen is not available. Yeast use alcoholic fermentation, and other organisms use lactic acid fermentation.